Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today is a very interesting day because it's time for us to talk about firepower. And I've got a man here who's going to tell me all about two meanings of the word firepower. And it's really relevant to climate and to military matters, both of which are issues I'm supposed to be concerned with. So, hello, Simon Dalby. How are you?
I'm just fine. Good to talk to you.
Yes. All right. Now, Simon Dalby is not here. I shouldn't mislead you. He's on a Gulf island in British Columbia. He is a professor emeritus at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. And he taught there at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and worked at the Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI, we call it. He is the author of a number of things, but I'm going to mention the current one called Pyromania, Fire and Geopolitics in a Climate Disrupted World. And I love the title. I can't claim to have read the book yet, though, but I have read an article that he just published in is it the Canadian Military Journal? Is that the title? Very interesting paper. And I was told by a Pugwash friend, I've been in Pugwash for about 50 years now, and I've been told that you gave a terrific talk in Ottawa recently. I presume it was a book launch kind of thing. Is that right?
It was a workshop that the Pugwash folks were putting together to begin their serious project on climate and security and related things. And to reduce my carbon footprint a little, I actually zoomed into that to do the talk online. It's something that allows me not to travel, but it also means I don't burn up as much jet fuel as I would if I actually did it in person.
It's not fair to ask you to summarize your whole book or your whole talk, but give me a peek at it anyway.
The book and the paper you kindly just mentioned both work with this double meaning of the word firepower. The firepower we normally think about is the military one. We think about shells and guns, and firepower gives you supposedly the power to win a battle. It's all about explosions and the use of combustion in its various forms, both in terms of detonations for explosions, but also, of course, propelling projectiles, whether it's missiles or artillery shells or even rifle bullets. That's having the ability to do that, having firepower, literally the power that fire gives us, is part and parcel of all military operations. But I got to thinking about fire in a different sense, because if you stop and you think about those projectiles, the fuel burning in missiles or the explosions in rifles or artillery that projects that a bullet or shell, it's that combustion is the source of what makes firepower a military asset. But if you think about it a little further, it's also the power that moves military vehicles. The Russians discovered this the hard way in 2022 when their tanks ran out of fuel on the way they hoped to Kyiv and never made it. And you begin to think about the ability to move militarily. It comes back to combustion, whether it's in jet engines or diesels or gasoline engines. At the heart of the power that allows militaries to move is combustion. It's fire. The controlled use of fire is what allows them to move. It allows militaries to arrange their equipment for combat. But when you stop and think a little further, you realize that that's actually the power that makes our modern societies function too. It's the controlled use of combustion. We still mostly drive in vehicles with internal combustion engines. Mm-hmm. And of course, our whole modern society depends on diesels and gasoline engines and so on to move all the essential stuff around. Many of us, alas, cook with natural gas, another form of combustion. We heat our homes, we heat our water. It's all about fire. Mm-hmm. Mostly carefully controlled, engineered fire. But that's the power that powers our societies. It quite literally is firepower, the power that fire gives us when we control it with all these devices and gadgets that we've built in enormous numbers over the last couple of centuries. And when you stop and think about the consequences of that, of course, you get climate change, because it's the emissions that come from all that combustion that are at the heart of the climate change problem. It's not the whole story, but it's a very big, large chunk of the story. And at the root of insecurity through the Cold War period was firepower at its very largest is the power that of fire that is generated by nuclear weapons, because while, yes, there's blast effects and radiation effects, many of the effects that come from using nuclear weapons are because of the combustion, the firestorms that nuclear weapons would suggest. And then I started connecting up the dots a little more and realized, well, back when I started as a graduate student, I was actually worried about nuclear winter. And again, ironically, it was climate change that would be caused if we had a major nuclear war by all the combustion products, the soot, the smoke, and all the other stuff that would be lofted into the stratosphere. That was what people were worried back in the 80s would aggravate dramatically the already huge consequences if there was a nuclear war between the Soviets and the Americans. At the heart of all of this is combustion. The power that fire gives us, when it's controlled, is great, but when it's not controlled, it's hugely destructive. And of course, ironically, now with the huge wildfires that are aggravated by climate change coming back to bite us, we realize that, ironically, it's fire. The power of fire is making us insecure through the effects of climate change as well. So here we have at the heart of what makes us powerful, but also makes us hugely vulnerable, is fire and our partial control of fire. Thinking about forms of insecurity that are basically when fire gets out of control. And the consequences of too much combustion, both for warfare and for climate change, are a common theme in what now makes us insecure in so many ways. A lot of this was inspired a decade ago by fire historian Steve Pine, who has that wonderful line about what makes us human, is that we're the only species that has learned what he calls the ignition trick. We've learned to at least partially, the ignition trick, we've learned to partially control fire, and no other species has learned to start fires. Yes, raptors sometimes move burning embers around to flush out prey in various parts, particularly in Australia, but that's not learning to start a fire and then partly control it. And that's what makes us human, but it's also what is changing both us and the planet very dramatically. So what I've tried to do is focus on this essential chemical process with all its geophysical consequences as a different way of grappling with climate.
One of the things that occurs frequently as I talk to people in the peace movement, and that's where I've spent much of my life, the people seem to say, "Give me a tip. How can we possibly tie the peace movement and the environmental or climate movement together? We need to make, if we could see that, if we could demonstrate that the cause that they are both needing to pursue, that they're compatible and mutually supportive, and we could work together better and make ourselves into a much more powerful movement." And it's really hard for me to see how to make that connection. The only easy connection that I can see is, yes, we say, well, whatever money you're spending on military matters is just that much less money that you have to spend on climate. And that's true, but that doesn't take you very far. And it seems to me that you have qualified and played with the concept of security in such a way as to do a much better job of showing how the climate is an issue for security. and that the military have the main responsibility for security and should certainly be thinking more about how their part, what their part is in the struggle against the climate crisis.
There's a number of ways you expand on that. I mean, yes, the military in many parts of the world has been taking this much more seriously than frankly, lots of civilian agencies, in part simply because when disaster strikes and civilian capabilities are overwhelmed, you call in the military. The Canadian military operates sort of aid to the civil power kind of operations under the code name of Operation Lentus. And in recent years, Lentus has been operationalized repeatedly, much more so in the last few years than it was in earlier times.
Excuse me, but that's a new word for me. Is it an acronym or what?
It's a military code word. They always assign a code word to particular kinds of operations, and this is the overarching one for the Canadian military is Operation Lentus. I have no idea where the term Lentus came from, but that's what they use.
Okay.
And if you watch some of the Canadian military websites, you will notice that there's repeated use of this term in recent years because they've been doing flood evacuations and trying to aid with fighting fires over the last few years on a much more frequent and bigger scale than they were in earlier years. And because of that, of course, they're going, wait a minute, this climate thing matters because it's changing how we do our operations. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's quite fascinating to talk to some of the military folks who've been involved in emergencies, particularly out where I am in British Columbia. The big fire up near Prince George last summer, when the military were heading for Kelowna, which is where they'd been asked to deploy to help. When they got there, the civilian authorities in British Columbia said, "Look, we have got nobody left. We're so busy fighting the fire here. We've nobody left to go and deal with that big one up in Prince George. Can you go up there and see if you can help?" And basically they turned their convoy around and drove north for 12 hours to Prince George because there was simply no civilian assets left. And they spent much of their time trying to coordinate evacuations and provide a communications relay there and do all that kind of stuff. Useful stuff. Thank goodness we have the ability to do some of this. But that isn't the prime mission for the military. It's supposed to be defense. And they're in fact being dramatically distracted repeatedly to go do other things, evacuate people, even provide water in emergencies in the Arctic in some cases. And so the American military has been all over this because they have over the last 15 years had repeated deployments to deal with disasters, and so they're starting to think much more seriously about this. But the crucial point is, well, actually, is this what militaries should be doing at all? We are simply not prepared to deal with climate change disasters on anything like the scale that we need to be. And as a result, of course, we have to call in the military to try and help, which is a damning indictment of the failure of civilian authorities to actually face up to the emergency that we're now dealing with. But beyond that, what else might we do in terms of linking military actions up with the climate crisis? One of the suggestions that has appeared in a number of places recently is arguing that the Paris Agreement idea about dealing with climate change isn't grappling with crucial aspects of the issue. If you go back and you look at the Paris Agreement from 2015, which was the big one that everybody finally signed on to, it doesn't mention fossil fuels.
I know.
It's all about
also, this is a side issue in a way, but it also none of these documents specify that military use of fossil fuels it counts. I mean, if you're setting quotas for countries to start, reducing their emissions, they just get a free pass with the military, which is Well, I would think if I were a military person in charge of trying to rethink the notion of security to include security from all of the disasters that are coming down the pike from the climate, that I would have a difficult time trying to decide what the implications would be for kind of weapons I want to purchase or vehicles and transportation and so on.
They are starting to address that.
Yeah.
They are beginning to realize that they too need to figure out how they get themselves off fossil fuels. But of course, for some of their activities, that's not so easy. That said, I mean, the American Air Force has been stringing solar panels all over its hangars for years, and the simple recognition that having some generating power on base gives them a bit of protection should the civilian grid, which most of them use to provide power for their bases, should that get disrupted. At least if they've got solar panels on their hangar roofs, they've got some electrical generation capability, and that is increasingly has been the case. But that's only a small part, obviously, of the military carbon footprint. But the connection back to firepower, I began to think about when folks are starting to think about Paris not being grappling with the question of fossil fuels, then we need what's sometimes simply called supply side action too. The climate change activists use the hashtag keep it in the ground, because the crucial point is if you keep it in the ground, it doesn't get burnt and it doesn't cause climate change. So how is it that we can tackle the fossil fuel industries and effectively phase them out? Because that is clearly what has to be done. The last couple of COPs, the big climate conferences, have finally got round to making it clear that this needs to be done against the vehement opposition of the fossil fuel companies and the oil companies in particular, who have effectively co-opted the COP programs in terms of setting the agenda and what gets agreed at the big conferences. But this has suggested to a lot of people that we need to focus on the production of fossil fuels, because clearly simply treating climate change as an emissions problem, a pollution problem, isn't grappling with the production of the fossil fuels in the first place, because if you keep them in the ground, they don't get burnt, so we don't have a climate change problem from them. The parallel there is quite direct, insofar as the whole arms control community through the period of the Cold War in particular was saying, well, if you don't make nuclear weapons, you don't have to worry about the consequences of nuclear war. Therefore, controlling the number of weapons that gets made and deployed is crucial to reducing the dangers of war. Well, the parallel is fairly direct with that other form of firepower, because if you don't get the oil or the coal or the gas out of the ground, you don't have to worry about the consequences. Mm-hmm. And when you start to think about this sort of instead of arms control, I don't think I actually put it in the paper, but I think about this in terms of fuel control, because, of course, combustion is based on fuel. That's what's causing climate change. So reducing the amount of fuel we use is crucial. When you think about this a little further along, then the arms control community actually should have all sorts of useful skills and techniques to provide. Because one of the problems with climate change is how do you count those things called emissions? And that's tricky because pipelines leak. It's not clear how efficient things are when it comes to how much carbon dioxide comes out of a particular fire. Counting all that stuff gets really tricky. But it's a whole lot easier to count tankers and pipelines and refineries and coal mines. You can monitor that in similar sort of ways to the ways that these things were counted and monitored in the nuclear arms treaties of the 80s and the 90s. You can spot all these movements of tankers and trucks and things with satellites, so you can actually count and monitor the production and the distribution of fossil fuels much more easily than you can actually monitor emissions. That's the pollution at the back end of the problem. So if we could convince governments that they really do need to stop producing fossil fuels, then the whole way of thinking about arms control, monitoring, national technical means was the term from the Cold War, about getting a really good surveillance system in place to make sure that nobody was cheating. The parallels there are actually very, very considerable. And the arms control community then could use some of its skills and its techniques.
In the article, you sent me your paper, and you referred me to the article by Charbonneau, I believe, who was the editor of the journal that you were published in. And he had some numbers there that I find I want to actually mention here, because I think that the first time I've seen such clear estimates. He says that the world's militaries, although they're largely they're spared from having to report their emissions, they contribute something between 1% and 5% of the global greenhouse gas. I didn't know that. Now, and of course, the Pentagon is by far the biggest one, and is often compared to countries like Portugal. That to me is fascinating. He says that the U.S. military missions account for between 1% to 2% of the total U.S. emissions, and that the U.S. Department of Defense in 2020 accounted for 76% of all the federal energy consumption and 75% of all federal greenhouse gas emissions. I have sometimes looked for numbers, that I could quote, and I couldn't find any. But this guy has found them, and do you think that you say it's hard to measure those things? Do you believe these numbers?
Well, I mean, they are ballpark estimates, obviously. I mean, that first one you said was somewhere between 1% and 5%. That's a very large range, right? Yeah. But I mean, just stop and think about it in terms of the federal vehicle fleets, for instance, in both governments. In the context of the Americans, I mean, they use a huge amount of jet fuel, simply transporting stuff around the world. Those big Globemasters and the Galaxies, those big transport planes are in the air, it seems, all the time, moving something somewhere. And when you stop and think about the sheer amount of fuel involved, moving big, heavy tanks and big, heavy military equipment, inevitably it's going to burn up a lot of fuel. That's just unavoidable.
Or even moving the fuel itself. Is a very, very inefficient thing to do. Yeah.
I mean, some estimates suggest that not just the military, but the whole fossil fuel system. Maybe something like 40% of the total amount of transport in terms of ships and trucks and things is actually directly or indirectly related to simply moving fuel around. I mean, one of the big arguments in favor of electrification and away from fossil fuels is the huge amount of steel and consequently the whole amount of energy used in making tanks and trucks and pipelines and refineries and all of this stuff. Uses a huge amount of stuff. Mm-hmm. In comparison, solar panels and windmills and so on use much less material to generate useful energy. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you get a double benefit in terms of electrification, because you're reducing the climate change from the direct combustion to make electricity or to move vehicles. But you're also getting an additional benefit insofar as you're not using huge amounts of energy to make vast quantities of steel for those tankers and trucks and pipelines and so on. So in fact, electrification gives you a double benefit in terms of reducing the environmental impact of energy.
I'm very interested and a great believer now in the importance of using technological climate repair methods. And I've talked to Gwynne Dyer several times about it. He's written 2 books on the subject. And he told me years ago that he got interested in it because he was a military historian and military analyst. And he kept going to the Pentagon, and this was like 15 years ago. And the people in the Pentagon were sort of behind closed doors talking about climate change as a big issue. and that made him believe, yeah, there's something he has to deal with it. Now, what I'm not clear, he didn't tell me whether they were talking about it in terms of the implications that it would give for their strategic analysis in geopolitical terms. How are they going to deal with various other countries given certain threats arising from climate change? And the political actions that these countries will be taking. Is that what they were talking about? Or were they already talking about what you have sort of mentioned, is that it's going to even impede the kind of equipment and weaponry that they use in handling these matters militarily? I don't know whether, it seems to me, I have never heard of a military person. I don't know that many of them, to be honest, but I've never heard any of them talking about, we've got to redesign how we fight because our weapons are too have too heavy carbon footprints, and so we've got to change our weaponry, and we even need to really. This may have some implications for our geopolitical decision making. How we're going to interact with other countries in certain threats, because we can't afford to do the kind of fighting that we are used to doing. I haven't heard anybody talk that way. Have you?
There's not much talking about that until fairly recently, when I mean, even NATO is now beginning to think seriously about how to reduce the carbon footprints of the militaries. Mostly the argument is, well, if everybody else is doing it in society, the military has to do it too. And certainly younger generations of soldiers are far more climate savvy than the senior commanders. And, they are looking at, well, what are we doing? Are we actually making matters worse, supposedly providing security? But if we're wrecking the climate and how we provide security, well, this doesn't make much sense. So there's certainly that conversation has increasingly been happening within the military. On the other hand, the pushback is, well, in a war, survival of your troops and killing the enemy has to be the priority. And all this green stuff is all well and good, but it's got to be done in a way that doesn't reduce our combat effectiveness. So that's basically the debate within the military. Back to Gwynne Dyer, your point about him. Of course, he got interested in this 15 years ago, and his first book on it was Climate Wars, because he actually was looking at some of the scenarios that the Pentagon was thinking about, because they stop and think about future wars. Because if you're thinking about what war you might be fighting in 15 years' time, you need to plan the equipment and the training and the doctrines and all the rest of it so that you're ready. And that's got a very long lead time. So the Pentagon does this kind of long-term scenario thinking. What kind of weapons do we need to buy for what kind of wars are we going to have 15 years out? Mm-hmm. This is part and parcel of any serious military planning. They frequently get it disastrously wrong, of course, but nonetheless, you need a plan, so you've got to think about these things. And indeed, that's sort of where he got involved in that initial conversation, because the discussion back then, going back 20 years now, really was what kind of future are we living in, and where might we have conflict as a result of climate change? So there's this huge discussion that I've been involved in now for longer than I care to remember, about, will environmental change actually cause conflict? And this goes back to the early 90s. Thomas Homer Dixon was, of course, a crucial part, and Tad and I have been involved in a desultory conversation about this for 3.5 decades now.
Okay, the point was, I want to hear about that, because I too think that's such an important issue that I've been interested in. And tell me which side are you on? Well,
I don't think there's a side in this.
I think there is. There's a question of reality. Are people moving, or do people move much as a result of climate problems? And do they become migrants? And Doug Saunders told me, I don't know whether he's published this, but he told me that he's been studying migration, and he doesn't think that climate change is really going to be a major source of migration because most people can't afford to move. The people who can go are the people, well-to-do people, and not that many of them. So he thinks that it's bad news in the sense that we aren't we won't even have the terrible dangers that we thought we might encounter because of the migration of all these climate refugees. They'll just sit there and die. I mean, he didn't quite use that language, but that seems to me the implication. They can't leave. Now, what do you think?
In many cases, that is the case. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's the affluent who can afford to move. The really poor, basically, if they can walk or swim, then their migration patterns are dramatically limited. If you can afford an airplane ticket and go across the world, it's a whole different story. But the really marginal poor people, in particular across the global south, simply don't have those options in many cases. The bigger debate was, well, does environmental change cause conflict? And the answer is a little unclear because it really depends on context. I think that it's probably fair to say that after 3 decades of looking at this, the answer is if the governments fail to provide for their population, if elites siphon off aid that is supposedly going to the poor and marginal, it generates resentment, which might cause conflict. In many cases across the global south, the wars of the 90s and the noughties, as we sometimes call them, were often about access to resources, because really in situations of extreme scarcity, you get famine, not war, insofar as people that are really hungry are looking for food far more than trying to organize military operations. The complexity of that, of course, is huge, and trying to tease out common factors that apply across the board has proved to be very difficult. And that, of course, is one of the things that Homer Dixon's work back in the 90s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember talking with Tad Homer Dixon about that, and I at the time I didn't think his case was as strong as. I mean, he was really arguing that is a major thing to look forward to
Really,
handling. That the conflicts are going to be largely environmentally caused. And I don't know.
Well, I mean, I tend to look at it the other way around, because insofar as there's insecurity from climate, it's not about poor people in the global south fighting. It's about us, and our consumption of vast quantities of fossil fuels is actually disrupting agriculture across the global south as well as in other places. So we've got the causality backwards on this. If we're serious about climate and security, it's the consumption of fossil fuels that's the issue, and that needs to be addressed. Worrying about some of the disruptions caused in the global south as a security threat to us is much less important than recognizing that we have to deal with the fossil fuel question. Then it's us in the global north that are predominantly using fossil fuels, or historically have. The issue now for across the global south, of course, is their development strategies have to be in ways that don't use fossil fuels. We need to get solar panels and windmills and whatever to the big cities of the global south as fast as possible. And given how cheap solar panels have become, that's now becoming possible in a way even 15 years ago it was hard to consider. In terms of the question of what it is that might cause conflict, it's worth also emphasizing that the folks in the global south that are suffering some of the worst consequences of climate change don't have a military option. They can't launch missiles at the tar sands in Alberta to stop production there. And likewise, it's difficult to close down oil wells in the Middle East if you happen to be a Bangladeshi peasant whose farm's getting flooded out by rising sea levels. You've got to stop and think very carefully about these kinds of situations. And of course, that's what Gwynne Dyer was beginning to pick up from the military 15 years ago. But he was also picking up the thing that is now increasingly part of the discussion. And that is, well, given the fact that we've got climate change kicking in, are there technical fixes, so-called geoengineering, that can be brought on stream to cool the planet, to deal with the worst symptoms of this? And of course, the one that everybody loves to hate is the idea of putting sulfur dioxide droplets into the stratosphere, the so-called solar radiation management, or stratospheric aerosol injection. Isn't not these wonderful bits of jargon? Yes. The point being to basically generate a sunshade in the upper atmosphere to cool things off. And of course, the dangers of that are what worries many of us, insofar as the unpredictable effects may cause climate meteorological disruptions. The big panic about this for a long time has been, well, what happens if it disrupts the Asian monsoon, because those monsoon rains feed at least half of the population of the planet. Rice and so on in Asia. If the rains don't come, then we've got a massive humanitarian disaster of extraordinary proportions on our hands. If we start doing it and we don't reduce dramatically fossil fuel use and find ways to suck some of the carbon out of the atmosphere, then we have to go on doing this forever, effectively. Or if it was to suddenly stop, we would have another piece of jargon, a termination shock, where the planet would suddenly dramatically heat if the sunshade is removed. Now, the technical details of this are a little more complicated, but that's basically what the fears have been. The nightmare scenario for many people, of course, was, well, the American military would decide to do this unilaterally. So that solar geoengineering would be weaponized, to use the jargon. The American military would decide to do it, and that might or might not work.
How would it be weaponized? I mean, it might be.
Well, hold on, just let me explain that, because the crucial point is that if the Americans decided to do it, and it caused disruptions to the monsoon or to some other climate system, other governments might claim that this was being deliberately done by the Americans to assert their dominance and to cause other societies pain and suffering, so that they wouldn't resist American efforts at controlling the world. Hence, it would be seen as a form of weaponization by American antagonists around the world. So that's what's been the real concern. Maybe some other military would do it, but the initial concern was that the Americans, having the technological capabilities of doing this, being the most affluent country on Earth, might be the first to do it. But the fear also is that this would then allow the Americans to go on doing their fossil fuel use. Because they've got rich and powerful
hazard argument.
We've got moral hazard arguments there too.
Yeah.
So all of this gets all tangled up in intriguing and fascinating, but macabre and horrifying debates.
Mm-hmm. I'm very frequently involved in this, because I've spent the last year. Most of the forums that I've been producing have been about geoengineering in one form or another, whether we call it that or not. So I've been talking to these guys, and I would say that SAI, this sulfur in the stratosphere notion, is probably the least likely of any to be implemented anytime soon. In fact, nothing is likely to be implemented anytime soon, because they couldn't do it if they wanted to. But they're getting close to some being able to implement certain things that I think there are less reasons to be worried about, oh, well, I shouldn't take a position about because I think really what we need is just a whole lot more research. And the people doing the research are the ones who say, yes, we need more modeling, and we need even more modeling way before we do any on the ground pilot studies. But I think that I think the people that I know who most approve of this, I'm thinking, for example, I had a conversation with Hugh Hunt at Cambridge, because the people at Cambridge, University of Cambridge, are promoting it, if you might say. And his angle is you learn by doing. By now we don't have enough time to do the kind of experimentation and scientific research that really should have been done. We should have started 40 years ago or 50 years ago, trying to solve some of these questions so that we know where the water is going to fall when the rains, when we spray the salt water into the clouds, for example. We should know what's going to happen. We don't, at least not well enough. But he says it's too late now to do all of that experimentation. But just start off small, do it a little bit, and gradually work your way up. And then if you're going to have a bad problem, it will eventually show up, and that's when you know you've learned something from it. And I think that's true. You don't dive into a swimming pool without sticking your toe in the water first to find out what it will be like. So we ought to stick our toe in, and then maybe our whole foot and start doing it soon, because I think there are a lot of technological solutions that really are much more plausible to me. But then, who am I to have an opinion?
As a teenager, I forgot to put my toe into the water in a swimming pool once, and I dived in without checking the temperature of the water, and boy, did I get a shock. It was way too cold. I made it to the other side of the pool and dragged myself out, and that was the end of the swim for that day. So yes, your metaphor works very nicely. I'm on record as saying that what we really do need to do first is get some kind of international governance mechanisms in place on this. Clearly, the transparency, in other words, all research on this really does need to be in the public domain. And we need some kind of oversight governance structure, whether it's under the auspices of the United Nations or some other international organization, so that all of these experiments are clearly monitored and the results are made available to all concerned.
Not only that, but I was talking a week or two ago with two guys who were doing something pretty adventurous, more ambitious project than most. And I said, isn't it time for something like a Manhattan Project, where every ounce of your energy gets concentrated in one big research project that's coordinated and organized to do it very, very quickly, because we are in an emergency. If people start taking seriously that this climate problem is not going to go away, and that it is going to get much more urgent very fast, then let's do it on a big scale globally with one big thing. And they said, we're not ready for it yet. Both of them agreed that going about it the way they're doing now, just having individual research projects think up their own research designs, that at the moment is more promising than one big coordinated so-called Manhattan Project. I don't know. Have you talked to anybody who had a different point of view about that?
The crucial point here is that having multiple different researchers working on different angles of this will probably generate stuff that we as yet haven't anticipated. Mm-hmm. If we decide we've got a technical fix and do one big centralized project, we may miss all sorts of technical fixes we haven't thought about. And at this stage, I think the old line about letting 1,000 flowers bloom is what we need to do. But please don't get distracted from the much more important point. What we have to do as a priority is reduce the use of fossil fuels.
Absolutely.
None of these techniques are really going to be helpful unless we grapple with the cause at the heart of this whole thing, which is the use of fossil fuels. Rapidly moving our economies off fossil fuels has to be priority number one. And if we lose track of that, then we're in danger of simply perpetuating the problem.
If you want to have some sort of global governance that that authorizes and monitors and looks after the safety of these things, you've got to start with a change in public opinion. People need to actually get concerned more than they are, and I spend my time trying to make people more aware of the dangers, and it's pretty discouraging. I mean, you must know this same feeling. It's not happening fast enough. What kind of proposal might have more influence quicker?
Well, my general sense of this is to go back to borrow a slogan from, of all people, Ronald Reagan. Most people think about Ronald Reagan as an actor and then as a president with a bit of governor experience in between. They forget the half a dozen years that he's spent between being an actor and a California politician, when he was a pitchman for General Electric and Westinghouse and a few other of the big electric companies. They were pushing all sorts of gizmos and gadgets for the kitchen and the house under the slogan of "Live Better Electrically." Mm-hmm. If you go and Google videos and do Ronald Reagan and look at that slogan, some of those old commercials from the 50s are fascinating. But the slogan is right. We have to think seriously about living better electrically, so we're not using fossil fuels to power much of what we're doing. The cleaning up the pollution from fossil fuels will improve health outcomes in numerous parts of the world, immediately and fairly directly. Not just the cities in Europe, which have banned cars, some of them for decades now. The air quality is better, the health, the whole culture of those cities is much better. We can live better in most parts of the world by reducing the use of fossil fuels quickly. I got an electric bike, actually. I now have 2 electric bikes. And frankly, my health is undoubtedly better because of the exercise I get. I need that bit of help from the electric assist on the hills. These old legs of mine don't pedal the way they used to, but I'm back on the bike. Even in hilly country, I can now go places and use my bike. Lots of other people are beginning to realize that electric bikes make a huge difference for urban living. Not great in Toronto in January, I get it. But nonetheless, there's all sorts of opportunities to begin to think about how to build cities and our lifestyles in ways that dramatically reduce the use of fossil fuels, and we'll be happier and healthier for doing it. Thinking about how to live better electrically, to use the old slogan, is crucial to all of this. You can do a whole lot of things better and cheaper. Once the solar power panels are on your roof and begin to cut your hydro bills dramatically, this helps in terms of the climate, but it also helps in terms of your monthly paychecks and how far they go too. There's all sorts of practical, simple things that make our life better if we don't rely so much on fossil fuels. If you think about the Lancet studies about the early deaths caused by fossil fuels, they're talking about millions across the planet every year are dying as a consequence of the pollution coming from fossil fuels. Now, never mind the long-term climate impacts. And I think we need a cultural change where we can do an awful lot of things better if we reduce the amount of fossil fuels we actually use in our lives. Electric vehicles are clearly a better option than internal combustion engines, but unfortunately, North Americans can't get access to a lot of the cheaper, better ones because of all the tariffs on Chinese imports and such things. The North American market has gone for the luxury and the Teslas, and it's been very slow to build vehicles at the bottom end of the market, where the Chinese in particular have been building cheap, reliable electric vehicles that are a tiny fraction of what is available here. More importantly, of course, is electrifying buses and trucks and getting those big diesel engines out of the system all of that stuff can now be done because battery prices are coming down. Solar panels are getting much cheaper. We need to concentrate on building better and doing so quickly, because we get immediate economic and health benefits as well as long-term climate benefits. And putting those things all together is what public policy really needs to focus on now. Getting that stuff right, then the debates about geoengineering and all the rest of it become less important, because we're focusing on getting ourselves off fossil fuels, controlling firepower, which is the dangerous aspects of it, far more effectively. That's where we need to focus our attention. And the slogan from Reagan works perfectly: live better electrically. And I think that's the kind of positive message that also ties into the discussions of things like Green New Deal, where you're actually making jobs, installing solar panels and retrofitting buildings, which is dealing with unemployment issues, and training up the trades, young people that want to earn a decent living, getting them electrician qualifications and electrical engineering degrees and that kind of stuff makes very good sense now, so that we can transfer our allegiance from fossil fuels to the new, much better, cleaner technologies which are fast becoming available. That's the challenge on the one hand. The other hand is trying to get a handle on fossil fuel production. And that's, of course, where the whole ideas about non-proliferation treaties, not expanding fossil fuel production, link up back with our discussion about security and the security sector and the arms control community.
Okay, I'm much more inclined to see promise in this attempt to change the structure of geopolitical realities than in persuading my neighbors to use a different kind of vehicles or anything else. Change our lifestyles. I'm not inclined to go around turning light bulbs off as much as I should.
Yeah,
because I think really the way you mentioned this non-proliferation treaty that's what I'd like to see us focus on, is getting some action at the international level, agreements to intensify our efforts to, for example, reduce the financial benefits given to fossil fuel industries. That seems to me to be quicker route than trying to persuade my friends to change their lifestyle.
Well, yeah, but you can improve your lifestyle, and in the process, you reduce the profits to the fossil fuel companies because you're not buying fossil fuels. I mean, that's a crucial part of it. Yeah, let's go back to just one more connection here, because the thing that I think is really important about the fossil fuels and our vulnerabilities and insecurities. If you stop and think about what happened in Europe 2 years ago when the Russians invaded Ukraine, there was a huge panic about fossil fuels, and particularly about gas supplies coming from Russia. There was a massive rush to build new infrastructure to produce more imports for Europe. But if you stop and think about this, the vulnerabilities are all built into the dependence on fossil fuels. In European case, if they had bit the bullet on this and moved faster on electrification, rather than just simply providing more natural gas, then they would not be dependent on imports from other parts of the world. They could work very quickly on cheaper electrical stoves and heat pumps and all the rest of it, in a ways that once they're installed, you're not dependent on fuel supplies from the other end of the world. You're not dependent on fluctuating prices for fuel. This is the point that the Brits should have learned over the last couple of winters, where prices were for electricity and for gas and oil fluctuated all over the place because of uncertainty about markets and imports. Get yourself off this. You've got better financial security, you've got better health outcomes, and you've got better climate consequences. If you can then, introduce the mechanisms you were just talking about trying to improve the geopolitical situation, well, if you're not dependent on fossil fuels, it gets a whole lot easier. Because you're not sending expeditions into obscure places to ensure that the fuel continues to flow. And if the Houthis decide to send a few missiles at ships in the Red Sea, well, if they're not carrying fuel, you're not dependent you're not dependent on that kind of disruption to your fuel supplies, because the sun and the wind is what's generating your electricity. Yes, you need to have a supply of spare parts, and you need to have those trained electricians to fix the solar panels if lands on one and breaks one. But if one's broken and you've got 15 on your roof, you've still got 14 working. There's all sorts of flexibilities and improvements built into the new technologies. And that's the other side of the coin, because security is improved. If you're no longer dependent on fossil fuel impacts, you get a triple whammy if you can get yourself off fossil fuels. And that's the crux of our new thinking about security, is to recognize just how vulnerable the power that has traditionally allowed us to become affluent is now coming back to bite us. And we can actually do a whole lot better if we get off our dependence on firepower.
That's true, and I love what you're saying. I'm not sure that I think I want to pin as much of my hopes on it as you do, because I think it's too late to get there just with that. However, that's a whole different conversation. Is anybody in Ottawa especially interested in what you are writing, or did anybody pay much attention to that journal, which was that one issue of the journal was specifically about security and climate, the relationship between that and the military. And I just, it's not caught on in any circles that I've been frequenting. And I just wonder if you know of places where they're really taking these considerations much more seriously than I'm aware of.
It's too soon to tell on the journal article. The Canadian Military Journal issues just out 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago. So it's far too soon to see how much uptake that's going to get. And the book is out now 6 months. I'm not quite sure who's reading it. I know a few people are. I've been involved in a number of conversations with the small but growing Climate Security Association of Canada that is spun off in part from the fact that Canada is now hosting the new Climate Centre of Excellence under the auspices of NATO. I've met some of the senior bureaucrats in Ottawa that are sort of raising an eyebrow and going, "Ooh, we need to think about this." So clearly there is some uptake there. We do still live in a country that is dominated by the fossil fuel industry. The folks in Ottawa seem to have great difficulty grappling with how to tackle the Alberta problem, and the fact that the current Alberta government is a wholly owned subsidiary of the oil industry. To a very substantial extent, unfortunately, this country is still a petro state. The focus on emissions is good. And the climate change initiatives, both from the feds and various provincial governments, are beginning to tackle our consumption end of this. What Canada has not done, and this is what we really do need to bite the bullet on, is dealt with our problem with production, because we are producing fossil fuels. Stephen Harper, remember him when he was Prime Minister, seemed to think this was a point of pride, that we were an energy superpower. As far as I'm concerned, it should, in present circumstances, be a matter of shame. Yes. The fact that in the context of climate change, we have an economic model that still depends on digging this stuff up, with huge damage done to the Alberta environment, massive emissions as a result of processing this stuff, should be a matter of great shame for all Canadians, because we should have moved past this a generation ago, and we should certainly not be continuing to advocate the use of fossil fuels.
I agree with you completely, and I'm very glad to have had this opportunity to talk about it. So good luck with the book and with your effort to light fires under people, other white people. And we will perhaps have another conversation another time, if I may. Everybody should go out and buy his book, Pyromania. This is Simon Dalby's book. Who's the publisher?
It's published by a little outfit called Agenda in Newcastle in England. It's available online easily in Canada, but there are some distribution problems with bookstores. So please do order it online.
The millions of people watching this are now all going to rush out and buy your book.
I hope so.
We hope. Good luck. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed
Thanks, Meta.
it so much.
Good to talk to you.
It. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Project Save the World produces these forums. This is episode number 623. You can find them all on our website. Just go to savetheworld.ca and look at the scroll window on the homepage. You can scroll around until you find a topic that interests you, and then click, and you can watch the forum right there. Project Save the World also produced a short course for people who want to become leaders in the movement to repair the climate. This course is available free of charge on the online learning platform Udemy. It consists of 5 short lessons about the use of soil amendments as a way of removing carbon from the atmosphere and sequestering it in the earth, thereby improving agriculture and increasing the world's food production while reducing the need for synthetic fertilizers. The course is entitled Become a Climate Change Influencer, and you can learn more about it at this link, www.udemy.com/course/become-a-climate-change-influencer. Finally, Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine, which now serves as a free of charge newsletter to help mobilize knowledge about 6 global threats to humankind. We gladly email the magazine as a PDF or link to any interested organization in the world that works to prevent a global catastrophe involving war and weapons, global warming, famine, pandemics, radioactive contamination, or cyber risks. Just email us at office@peacemagazine.org and we'll add your group's email address without charge to our list. For individual subscriptions at $20 Canadian per year, go to pressreader.com on your browser and search for Peace Magazine.